We ended last week's lesson listening to Job describe the greatness of God's power, ruling over the skies and the seas and all of creation. Job even said that he hadn't even scratched the surface of what God can do. How can Job understand it? He's only able to understand the outer fringes of what God can do. We just hear a faint whisper when he speaks. And Job concluded last week by asking, who can understand the thunder of his power? This week his three friends have gone silent now. Everyone is exhausted after the long conversations they've had. We've spent 25 chapters listening to the conversation and debate between the friends and Job. After all those thousands of words have been spoken about Job's character and God's character, still, we're left with just a whisper of what we hear from God. God must be far greater than anything we can understand or even imagine. In today's lesson, in the book of Job in the Old Testament, we'll look at chapters 27 through 31. This is going to feel very different today because Job now is the only one we hear from in these 5 chapters. So here are some key things to listen for. Job is going to make an oath in the name of God. Job will deliver one of the most beautiful poems on wisdom. He'll compare the life he used to have with the life he's having now. And finally, Job ends with a written oath proclaiming his innocence. And Job's going to challenge all of his accusers to do the same and put their indictments in writing for everyone to see. We're going to be busy as we listen only to Job today, so before we hear from him, let's listen to a song about Job that will be a lot of fun because it uses a familiar melody. I'm sure you've heard it. You may be humming this tune the rest of the day. It's called The Story of Job.
Hey Job, don't be so sad. God takes bad times and makes them better. Remember, Jehovah lives in your heart, and He will start to make it better. Hey Job, don't be afraid. You were made to keep God at center. The devil, he put the boils on your skin, and God will begin to make them better. So anytime you feel the pain, hey Job, refrain. Don't let others get you in the blame game. Now just stay faithful to the Lord, and your reward is you'll beat the devil in the Lord's name. Na 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 na. Hey Job, don't let him down. You have found that God's grace is greater. Shut sin out and let God in. Remember, hey Job, keep His praise in your heart, and He will start to make it better. So shut sin out and let God in. Hey Job, you'll win. Although you may feel like you've been trampled. 'Cause Job, you know that God loves you, and when it's through, He'll give you more kids and sheep and camels. Na 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 na. Yeah. Hey Job, don't be so
A quick thought about the song we just heard. Songs throughout history have borrowed folk tunes and popular melodies, sometimes for speed to complete a song quickly, and other times to take advantage of a comfortable vocal range to make the song more enjoyable and easier to sing. Our artist in today's song, The Story of Job, borrowed a melody from what most people consider the greatest musical band of all time, the Beatles. Well, let's get back to our story in Job with the first point we want to make today. It's the oath. In chapter 27 and verse 2, Job begins by making an oath to God saying, "As surely as God lives." Even though Job understands that God is behind his suffering, there is no one higher than God that he can appeal to. He knows that God is the sovereign ruler over the heavens and the earth, and even the underworld in Sheol. God sees all. He has knowledge of everything. And Job is convinced that nothing can happen to him that is outside of God's will. Even though Job has complained about his suffering to God and believes that he has not received justice, he will not turn his back on God. In front of his friends, he declares that as long as God gives him the breath of life, he will not speak against God. And in chapter 27, verses 5 and 6, he tells his three friends that he will never admit that they are right. Job will not say something that goes against his character just to ease the pain and suffering. Job will never let go of his righteousness, and Job will not bribe God by confessing to something just so he can be restored to prosperity and happiness. Oaths were serious business in Job's day, and he was going to stand on his integrity even if it cost him his life. Job still has to live with himself. So it seems pretty clear that his friends have not succeeded in wearing Job down. In fact, Job is stronger than ever. But the tables will now turn. Job challenges his friends in verses 7 through 12, letting them know that they may end up being treated like the wicked man they've been describing. All this time, the friends have been trying to convince Job that he's a sinner and a horribly wicked man. And now Job tells his friends in verse 12 that they know better than to accuse him of wickedness. All that they have succeeded in doing is wasting everyone's time with meaningless talk. And Job concludes chapter 27 by describing to his friends what the wicked really look like and what they will receive as their punishment. And if the friends are not careful, the punishment they've laid out for Job will come back on them. But the second point in our story today is the wisdom poem in chapter 28. All of the energy that was used by his friends to attack Job and all the bickering that took place fades away for just a moment. Chapter 28 becomes a quiet moment in the midst of this storm. As you're reading this chapter 28, you may see that it could have been set to music as a hymn, or it could be a meditation reflecting on all that's happened. Or it could be that this might be a moment where you hear Job as a truly deep thinker, a philosopher. It may be all three. It may be a hymn, it may be a meditation, it may be philosophy. But in our study so far, we've been exploring this penetrating question that most people ask when going through suffering. Why? Why do people suffer? Why does a loving God allow suffering? Is there some sin in my life or sin from someone else that's brought on my suffering? Can anything good come from my suffering? And of course, the big question that we ask, why me? Why am I suffering? In this chapter, we're going to look at yet another question. Where do you go to find wisdom and understanding? Or you might say it this way, how can I understand what's going on? So let's work through chapter 28 in three parts. The opening poem, or the hymn, is recorded in verses 1 through 11. This is a fascinating look at what people 4,000 years ago were doing to explore their world. We like to think of ourselves as highly advanced and capable of exploring moons and planets in the heavens above, diving down into the seas to uncover the mysteries below. It's amazing what we've discovered using our minds and our ingenuity, how often, though, do we consider that one discovery builds upon an earlier discovery? I thought about that this week, and it reminds me of the famous quote by Isaac Newton back in the 17th century. Newton said, "If I have seen further, it's by standing on the shoulders of giants." In fact, there's a sculpture on Research Forest Drive about a block from our church in the Woodlands with those very words engraved in bronze. Another example? Have you ever seen the stained glass windows in the Chartres Cathedral in France? It's about an hour south of Paris. The architects of this Roman Catholic cathedral had the same idea as Newton, but about 5 centuries even earlier in 1194. If you look closely, you can see the New Testament apostles on the shoulders of the Old Testament prophets. And all of them are looking at Christ in the center of the rose window. We build upon those who have gone before. And we know that all wisdom and creativity come from Christ the Creator. And then it's our turn to help the next generation. And if you follow that pattern for thousands of years, you will have the accumulated wisdom of men and women brought to the present day. We owe a lot to those early explorers in Job's time, 4,000 years ago, who, like us, were driven to know what was unknowable. So starting with this beautiful wisdom poem in chapter 28, verse 1, look at the description of the mines that were drilled deep into the earth. Yes, 4,000 years ago, precious metals and gems such as gold and silver, iron, copper, and sapphires were chiseled out of the darkness. Technology in that day penetrated the deepest recesses of the earth, far from where people live or walk. So deep underground that no bird or animal has ever seen it or set foot on it. Verse 4 says they risked their lives by dangling and swaying. Mining and exploration were dangerous then, and it's still dangerous today. Talk about high tech. This is really an amazing window into ancient mining. It must have been a similar experience with the technology that we use to explore the blackness of space almost 60 years ago in May 1961, when Alan Shepard became the first American in space. It clearly shows that God created men and women in His image from the very beginning. Human beings created by God with intelligence, a desire to explore, a desire to create, and a desire to seek wisdom. The second part of the poem in chapter 28 is found in verses 12 through 22. So we're going to move from a high of exploration to a low, even into Sheol, in our search for wisdom. Job asked the same questions we ask. Where can wisdom be found, and where does understanding dwell? These are such important questions that Job even asked them twice. He says the same thing in verse 12 and again in verse 20. Where can wisdom be found? We've just seen how we used our human intellect to bring hidden minerals from the depths of the mines to the light of day. But where do we dig to uncover wisdom? What mine holds the answers? Job points us toward the answer in the following verses. We can't find wisdom in the land of the living. There is no mine that holds the key. We can't find it in the depths of the oceans. We can't even use the precious metals and priceless gems that we just dug out of the earth to buy wisdom. Verse 21 says that wisdom is hidden from every living thing. Well, since we can't find the answer among the living, and the dead won't reveal the secrets, what do? Well, thankfully, Job reveals in the third part of the poem in chapter 28 that there is a source of wisdom, and it really can be found. In verses 23 through 28, the words of the poet say that God alone knows where wisdom dwells. Where? It dwells in God. He's the one who knows the path to wisdom. Unlike the birds, the animals, and we as humans who are shown in this chapter to have limits, God knows no limits. He's the one who sees everything. He's the one who establishes the force of the wind. measures out the waters. He's the one who creates rain, thunder, lightning. Wisdom has been with God from the very beginning, but Job says that God does not just store it within himself. No, he reveals it throughout his creation. We can see it on display every day. It's all around us because God built it into his creation. This is such a great chapter. We're going to go off script today and listen to another poem set to music that fits in so beautifully. This is from Isaac Watts back in 1715. Here's I Sing the Almighty Power of God.
I sing the mighty power of God that makes the mountains rise, that spreads the flowing seas abroad and build the lofty skies. I sing the wisdom that ordained the sun to rule the day. The moon shines full at his command, and all the stars obey. I sing the goodness of the Lord that fills the earth with food. He formed the creatures with his word, and then pronounced them good. Lord, how thy wonders are displayed where'er I turn my eye. If I survey the ground I tread, or gaze upon the sky, there's not a plant or flower below, but makes thy glories known. Or clouds arise and tempests blow, by order from thy throne. While all that borrows life from thee is ever in thy care, and everywhere that man can be, thou God art present there. Amen.
While that music about the power of God continues to ring in our ears, do you remember Paul in the New Testament talking about this very subject of creation in Romans chapter 1, verses 19 through 23? You can open that up in your Bible in Romans chapter 1. Well, let's read that together. Paul said, "What may be known about God is plain to the wicked, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God, nor gave thanks to him. But their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals and reptiles." What we see in Romans, in the New Testament, and in Job, in the Old Testament, is that men and women are able to see God everywhere because he's revealed to us through his creation. So that leaves us with a choice. Do we rely on our own intellect and ingenuity, really, in effect, worshiping the created world? Or do we recognize that God is the creator and the author of wisdom, and that we can become wise only through trusting God? In verse 28, that concludes the poem by loudly proclaiming, and here's what it says: "The fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to shun evil is understanding." Do you hear the echo from the opening verse of the book of Job? The Bible says Job was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. No wonder Job was known as the greatest man among all the people of the East. Well, if I were writing this, it seemed like this would be a great place to end the book. But we still have a few more laps to run. In chapters 29 through 31, Job brings his defense to an end. We've already heard that Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar are silent. Now it's Job's turn to offer up his defense and his closing arguments. Our third point in our story today is a review of the life that Job used to have. We see Job in chapter 29 waxing nostalgic and remembering all of the good times in the past. He recalls his glory days when he had a beautiful wife, a house full of children, servants, and huge tracts of land filled with livestock. This brought him great honor in the community, and he was respected by everyone. Have you found yourself reflecting on the past too when going through a hard time? Think about this current pandemic. We're cooped up and we're not supposed to be away from home any more than necessary. Vacations have been canceled. Trips to see family and friends have been postponed. What is one of the things that we think about? We reminisce, just like Job. We reminisce about past trips, the joy of going places, visiting with friends. And now we want to see people again and bring back those good times. There's a balance, isn't there? Everyone goes through suffering, but we also experience joy, friendships, and happiness. Well, Job certainly goes down memory lane in chapter 29, thinking about when he was strong and happy and when he was God's close friend. He remembers when the young men in the community showed respect. They stepped aside when Job walked by. The older men, they showed their respect by standing when Job arrived at the city gate. The politicians, this is hard to believe, they stopped talking when Job came near. And Job helped everyone in the community, including the widows, the orphans, the poor, the disabled, the oppressed. He didn't hoard his wealth. He cared for everyone. Have you known people whose smile would light up the whole room? That was Job. Verses 29 and 30 say that the smile on his face was precious to people. He was seen as their chief and king. His spoken words were valuable. People appreciated his leadership in the community. They became wise just listening to Job. Job recalls in verse 18 how he planned out even his peaceful death. As long as his life continued with blessings, Job could see the future. Job thought he would die in his own house with family all around him, and his name would be honored by all. And that's how chapter 29 ends, but chapter 30 opens with a check on reality. It opens by saying, but now. Job's got to come back down to earth and return to reality. Chapter 30 says, the young men in the community now mock him. He's covered in ashes. His children are gone. His wealth has been destroyed. No one wants him around. His honor and his respect have been taken from him. Job describes these taunts in verse 14 in chapter 30. The young men walk all over him as if they have entered in through a breach in the city's defensive wall. And finally, in verse 20, Job says he cries out to God in his pain, but he gets no answer. That silence from God must have been painful after he just recalled in chapter 29 the blessings and the close relationship Job once had with God. He's resigning himself to a humiliating death now in Sheol. He goes on to say the skin disease is causing his body to turn black. Suffering never ends. He burns with a fever. No longer is there the memory of parties and family celebrations, food piled high, dancing, music. Verse 31 concludes by saying that his harp is now tuned to mourning, the flute to the sound of wailing. Job has gone from happy memories in chapter 29 to the depths of darkness in chapter 30. Job concludes his defense in chapter 31. This final point is where he proclaims his innocence and his love for God by taking an oath. And to prove it, Job makes a long list of sins that he was accused of committing by his friends. And Job uses the word if almost 20 times here in chapter 31. He uses it to bring his point home as part of his defense. If he has truly committed any or all of the sins, then let the corresponding penalties be applied to him. So here's an example. Look at verse 13. Job says he doesn't even know how he'll respond to God if he mistreated his servants and denied them justice. Job goes on to say in verse 14 that he knows that God created him just the same as he created his servants. In the eyes of God, Job knows that he's equal with his servants. In verses 16 through 22, Job says that if he didn't care for the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the needy, then God should strike him and remove his arm, since he didn't lift a finger to help others. The final if statement is found in verses 38 and 40. Job says that his land should be cursed with thorns and weeds if he didn't properly care for the land and the tenants who work the land. Job is looking for justice from God, so Job reminds God that he has been just with his possessions and with the people. Chapter 31 is a powerful oath that would have been commonly used in Job's day. It's a written declaration stating his case. He's challenging anyone to refute his claims. And if there is a flaw in his reasoning or he's guilty of a crime, then a person would need to state their claim in writing. People could then compare and evaluate both sides of the argument to form their conclusion. Job shows his confidence in a not guilty verdict in verse 37. He says that he welcomes the opportunity to give an account to his accuser, and that he would do so boldly and honestly. And Job signs his name to the oath in verse 35, and he does so in front of God. Job's only hope is that God hears his story and restores honor to his name. Meanwhile, his three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, they're all betting against Job, absolutely sure that God will condemn Job. Well, we're going to have to wait for another lesson to see which side is right. As we conclude today, here are a couple of observations. If you're looking for the precious things in life, the things that will last, don't skim the surface. You need to go deep, like the ancient miners did, digging for precious metals and jewels. Secondly, if people risk their lives and work hard like the miners to pile up wealth and knowledge and prestige in this life, do we as Christians work just as hard to dig into the words of the Bible to gain lasting treasure in God's wisdom? It takes discipline and work to study and pray, listen to God, and then do what He wants us to do. It's not easy, but isn't it worth it? In a moment, we'll hear our theme song, Whatever May Come, but first, let's pray. Father, we come to you today seeking wisdom that leads to lasting treasure. We know from Job that it only comes from you and not from the things of the world and what they offer. Give us a heart, Father, to dig deep, uncovering the treasures that are waiting for us, treasures of wisdom and understanding that only come from you. Amen.
Understanding why all things happen is not my affair, for I can't even see tomorrow. I just know that you'll be there. But each choice I make in the face of what happens to me is the gift that you gave me, and I'll use it, Lord, for Thee. All things work for good to me, I know. Lord, I don't deserve it, but even so, your blessings still come. And so I'll suffer, Lord, for you. And in this life I will be true. I'll praise you in all that I do, whatever may come, whatever may come. Understanding why all things happen is not for me to see, for only you can see tomorrow as it's being prepared for me. So take the good and the bad, Lord, still trusting in you. When you give, when you take away, to you I will be true. I know my Redeemer lives, and so all things work for good to me, I know. Lord, I don't deserve it, but even so, your blessings still come. And so I'll suffer, Lord, for you. And in this life I will be true. I'll praise you in all that I do, whatever may come. I know my Redeemer lives, and so all things work for good to me, I know. Lord, I don't deserve it, but even so, your blessings still come. And so I'll suffer, Lord, for you. And in this life I will be true. I'll praise you in